Everybody, this is Dr. Tom Murphy, USDA Animal Research Center. And anyway, so moving from point A to point range. Tom, you go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Brett. So like Brett said, my name's Tom Murphy, and I'm a sheep geneticist at the Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska. Doing a little research on the Rocky Mountain Katahdin Association. I did see Nebraska's included in that, although we're on the pretty far eastern front range of the Rockies. Maybe someday we'll be able to host the meeting. So I'm going to talk about genetic improvement of Katahdins in a general sense. This really can be applied to any breed and any production environment, but what tools we talk about today can help you get a productive Katahdin range flock. Whenever I talk about genetic improvement of sheep, I go back to this graphical representation that my major professor, Dave Thomas, used to show. So on the vertical axis here, we have some measure of flock performance. That could be ewe lambing rate or parasite tolerance. And on the horizontal axis, we have time. So genetic improvement begins with first identifying the right breed type that meets our production goals and is suited for our production environment. And you've all chosen the Katahdin as that base breed. But you also know that if you just stop there, your flock performance from a genetic standpoint is going to be stagnant over time. You're not going to change it. In order to move our flocks forward genetically, we need to start applying some pressure and accurately identifying and selecting those individuals that are genetically superior and keeping them as replacement animals. And then our final strategy that is often overlooked in purebred circles, as it's kind of a curse word, but crossbreeding, crossing two or more genetically improved breeds is still the most rapid form of genetic improvement. So in this discussion, I'm going to mostly focus on how we can most accurately identify our genetically superior Katahdins to improve performance in our production environment. So this starts with a thorough understanding of what we refer to as the basic genetic model. This model tells us that an individual's phenotype or their performance for a trait that we can see or measure is a combination of the gene variants that they carry, which influence their performance, along with the environment that they perform in. And we refer to the heritable component of an individual's genetic makeup as their breeding value. And all other factors that might impact an animal's performance can be considered environmental effects. So for example, this ram's phenotype for weaning weight may have been 52 pounds, but not all lambs weigh 52 pounds at weaning. And part of the reason that this ram may have weighed more or less than others is in part due to his breeding value or genetic merit for weaning weight. But it's also partly due to all of the non-genetic factors that can impact weaning weight, like how old he was at weaning, his dam's age and milk production, whether he was born or raised as a single or twin or triplet. All of these are non-genetic, and they cloud our ability to see what the true genetic merit of this ram, what for weaning weight is. So an important concept in selection is heritability. Heritability gets discussed a lot. I think you've all heard this term, and it's usually described mathematically as a population measure that's the proportion of phenotypic variation attributable to variation in breeding value. This is correct, but it doesn't really give you a lot of intuition on why heritability is so important in selection and how we can use it to our advantage. A trait's heritability is just a number ranging from 0 to 1. And what it really tells us is it indicates the strength of the relationship between an individual's phenotype that we can see or measure and their breeding value or genetic merit. Another equally true definition is heritability measures the degree to which the phenotype of a parent is going to resemble the phenotype of their offspring. So in this table, I've listed typical heritabilities for economically important traits in sheep production. We have low heritability traits like survival and number of lambs born. Our most highly heritable traits across sheep production are ones that most hair sheep producers don't care about because they're associated with fleece traits. But other economically important traits like weaning weight, ultrasound loin depth, fecal egg count, these fall into a moderately heritable category. So what this variation in heritability across traits tells us is that not all traits are created equally. In particular, for lowly heritable traits, such as our fitness traits, this means that an individual's performance for the trait doesn't reflect their true genetic merit for the trait very well. And an individual's performance for the trait that we see or measure won't reflect their progeny's performance for the trait very well either, because of the large amount of environmental effects that can influence these lowly heritable traits. Okay, so we've broadly defined an animal's breeding value as their genetic merit for a trait. But a true breeding value is defined as the sum of all of the independent effects of all of the gene variants that an animal carries, which can impact their phenotype or performance. So it's kind of theoretical, but if we imagine peering into this ram's genome and writing along his DNA, every time we encounter a gene that impacts weaning weight, we'd note what the effect of the gene variant he had at that location was, and we'd add them all up. And in doing this, we'd notice a few things. First of all, gene variants can have both positive and negative effects on performance. Secondly, most economically important traits are impacted by many genes. We're talking hundreds, thousands, if not more. And finally, most genes have pretty small effects on performance by themselves. In this example, we might see that each gene variant only positively or negatively impacts weaning weight by 1/100th of a pound. But when we add all of these up across the entire genome, we can see pretty large differences in breeding value or genetic merit between individuals. So this ram, in this example, had more favorable gene variants than unfavorable, and it resulted in a breeding value for weaning weight of +4 pounds, or he has the genetic merit to weigh 4 pounds above his breed's average at weaning. The problem is we don't actually know all of the genes that impact performance for every trait, and we don't know all of the independent effects of all of these gene variants. This means that we'll never actually know an animal's true breeding value. But like anything we don't know with absolute certainty, we can predict or estimate it. And in this case of breeding values, we refer to them as estimated breeding values, or EBVs. Now we make these predictions of EBVs using the phenotypes that we record on individuals and that we record on their genetic relatives. But for all predictions, accuracy matters, right? Brett was talking about your weather this morning. Yesterday, you had a prediction of what it was going to be like today. It didn't meet that prediction. It was poorly accurate. So our accuracy matters in any prediction. And in the case of breeding values, how accurate we are predicting an animal's true genetic potential from their performance records depends on how many performance records we're considering in our prediction and the heritability of the trait. So ultimately, an EBV, an animal's EBV for a trait, tells us their genetic worth as a parent. So the best estimate of breeding value would be to randomly mate 2 or more rams to a very large group of ewes, and then evaluate where their progeny perform relative to one another and to the rest of the breed. So again, we'll consider weaning weight, but we could do this for any trait. We take the average of each ram's progeny's performance and see that progeny from ram 1 on the left weighed about 3/4 of a pound below average for the breed, whereas progeny from ram 2 on the right were about 1.5 pounds above breed average. Since parents transmit half of their genes to their progeny, we multiply this by 2 and conclude that ram 1's EBV for weaning weight is -1.5 pounds, and ram 2's EBV for weaning weight is +3 pounds. How accurate these EBVs are, though, depends on how many lambs we evaluated per ram and the trait's heritability. So the equation we use to calculate EBV accuracy in this example isn't really important for you to remember, but seeing how EBV accuracy changes with number of records is a pretty important concept. So if we generated 25 lambs per ram, took their average weaning weight to estimate that ram's breeding value for weaning weight, we'd have an accuracy of about 75% for that particular trait, which is pretty good. 85% accuracy with 50 lambs per ram, and so on. And it would take 620 lambs evaluated per ram if we wanted our EBV to have an accuracy of 99%. Unfortunately, most of us don't have the resources to conduct such large-scale progeny tests on every potential ram prospect we have. And this is not biologically possible to assess ewes with high accuracy, right? Maybe a ewe might have 25 lambs in her life, but she's not going to have 50. Furthermore, we'd prefer not to generate a bunch of poor performing lambs just to conclude a ram has a poor EBV. But fortunately, we can still calculate EBVs on animals that don't have any progeny by considering that individual's phenotype and or the phenotypes of their genetic relatives that they have up to the point of evaluation. So this might be the most important point that I want to make. I've been involved in the National Sheep Improvement Program for several years now, and I still hear a lot of negative perceptions of it from sheep producers around the country. Ultimately, they feel that a number, or in this case an EBV, can't tell us how an animal's progeny are expected to perform. You have to actually see the animal. And when you ask these people, how then do they select replacement animals, they usually tell you, well, they use a combination of visual appraisal and performance records. But what they don't realize is that anytime we use phenotypes or performance to infer an individual's genetic merit for a trait, we are estimating that individual's breeding value. They might not realize it, but that's what they're doing. And we all do this. We might say, this is my fastest growing ewe lamb. She should be genetically superior for growth than those slower growing ewe lambs. We are using that ewe lamb's performance to infer her genetic merit. We might also say that ram lamb was born a single. He should be genetically inferior for number of lambs born than those twin ram lambs. Again, we're using the performance of this ram's dam to infer his genetic merit. It's an estimated breeding value. But when we only use an individual's performance to estimate their breeding value, and if we don't do a really good job at accounting for non-genetic influences on performance, our resulting EBVs can be very inaccurate. And we might unsystematically correct for non-genetic effects, right? Kind of our gut feeling when we assess our replacement animals. We might say, well, this was my fastest growing ewe lamb, but her full sister was just middle of the road. So here we're using additional information on a genetic relative to further guide our selection efforts. We might also say, well, this ram lamb was a single, but his mother was a ewe lamb or a yearling, to correct for the non-genetic effect of dam age. When we calculate EBVs and NSIP, though, we're much more systematic. First, individual phenotypes are adjusted for non-genetic effects, such as sex, birth type and rear type, their contemporary group, or a group of individuals that were reared together closely in time or space. And what this does is it puts everybody on a level playing field phenotypically, remove those non-genetic effects on performance. Then when we calculate an individual's EBV, we're not just considering their own performance for a trait. We still consider it, but we consider the performance of all of their genetic relatives because they share genes in common with their genetic relatives. In calculating an individual's NSIP EBV, records from their genetic relatives are essentially weighted by how closely related they are. So records from a close genetic relative, like an individual's full sibling or parents, have more of an influence than records from more distant genetic relatives, like uncles and cousins. But they all go into the estimated breeding value. NSIP EBVs actually go a step further than this because it's in a cross-flock national genetic evaluation program. Because individual flocks that are enrolled in NSIP have shared genetics with one another, they've established pedigree linkages that enable us to account for different management or production environments unique to each operation. So EBVs can now reliably be compared across flocks that might be very different from one another. So here's a map of the current NSIP Katahdin flocks, including your 3 USDA ARS research stations. You can see that we've definitely got some growing to do in the Intermountain West. I think part of the reason why some producers are hesitant to trust NSIP EBVs fully is because to them it seems like a black box. Phenotypes or performance goes in and EBVs come out, and they're not able to see the inner workings. But the recipe behind EBVs isn't a secret. It's just a little complex and consists of a lot of mathematical and statistical jargon. But we all use complex technologies in agriculture every single day, right? Who can fix a tractor that was built this year anymore? EBVs are no different. Their methodologies were developed and continue to be developed by scientists at many of your land-grant universities and ARS locations, and they've been thoroughly vetted and proven for several decades. So at the end of the day, NSIP EBVs provide us a much more accurate assessment of an individual's genetic merit than we can get from just visual appraisal or considering that individual's performance by itself. So to demonstrate this, on the left, we've got what we'll refer to as the traditional way of evaluating a ram. We're considering his genetic merit for number of lambs born, weaning weight, and fecal egg count, and we're just using his own performance, or in the case of number of lambs born, his dam's performance. So we see that he was born a twin, and we imagine he should be carrying genes that increase lambing rate. But this wasn't his phenotype, this was his dam's phenotype. And again, lambing rate is a lowly heritable trait, which combines to give us a very low accuracy of just 16% for his genetic merit for lambing rate. For more moderately heritable traits like weaning weight or fecal egg count, we see that just considering this ram lamb's performance for those traits serve as a somewhat decent indicator of his genetic merit with accuracies of 45 and 55%. But no matter how good we are at evaluating animals visually or with few performance records, if we only consider this single source of information, we'll never get higher accuracies than this. So on the right, we're depicting the information that might go into an NSIP EBV. We've got the same ram lamb, he's got the same performance, but we're not just going to consider his performance, we're going to include the performance of all of his genetic relatives available to us. This could be full siblings, half siblings, sire, dam, great grandparents, all of them. So when we do this, we vastly improve our accuracies for all traits, particularly for lowly heritable traits. Here we've got real accuracies from real NSIP Katahdin ram lambs born in 2020, and none of them, when I got these accuracies, had progeny records yet. Okay, so they're unproven ram lambs. For number of lambs born, we've got accuracies ranging 36 to 50%, which is much higher than when we just considered that ram lamb's birth type and had an EBV accuracy of 16%. We still do see improved accuracies for our more highly heritable traits too. We've got unproven ram lambs in NSIP with EBV accuracies of nearly 75% for fecal egg count because of the extensive pedigrees that exist in NSIP, as well as the extensive amount of performance recording that's taken place in this breed over the years. But we still have some NSIP non-believers out there. And I've started compiling a list of some of the common sayings I hear when I encounter some of these people. A common one is NSIP EBVs just aren't accurate enough. And again, what we've shown is it doesn't matter how good you are at evaluating an animal. Okay, this is coming from a collegiate livestock judge. NSIP EBVs will always be a more accurate assessment of an animal's true genetic merit for economically relevant traits than just considering a single performance record. Another one I hear is people may think that because they have higher performing sheep than some NSIP producers, there's no point in joining the program. And NSIP is not a breed. It's an organization that enables us to more accurately identify genetically superior individuals within a breed, no matter how high performing they are. For breeders outside of NSIP, there's no saying how much of your improved performance is due to your environment or management system. But there are individual sheep out there not enrolled in NSIP that are genetically superior to NSIP sheep. And we've shown this with progeny testing many times before, but it takes progeny testing to find those individuals. We just can't accurately identify them beforehand by just looking at them. Another misconception out there is that we're pushing everyone to join NSIP. NSIP is a program for seed stock producers. Commercial producers are the foundation of our industry, but we don't need them enrolled in NSIP. That does not exclude them from benefiting from NSIP though. Buying breeding rams or replacement ewes, if you're not generating your own, from seed stock producers with the aid of NSIP EBVs should really be the standard operating procedure in the US sheep industry going forward. We have some producers that were once enrolled in NSIP, but have since quit because they didn't see the results they wanted to see. Genetic improvement is not a get-rich-quick scheme. It's a long game. Our time scale is in sheep generations, not days or months or even a couple of years. So most of these producers either didn't buy in fully to the program or they just quit too early. I've heard people say, look what EBVs, or in the case of beef cattle, EPDs have done to the beef cattle industry. Why would we make the same mistake in sheep? And I don't fully understand this one. Using EPDs in cattle have vastly improved production efficiencies. We now produce more beef with fewer cows. With these larger carcasses, mature cow weight is larger than it was 30 or 40 years ago. but EPDs themselves did not do this. We can use EBVs in our flocks and take them whatever direction you want to. If you want to decrease mature weight or decrease your lambing rate for whatever reason, you can do that, and you can do it most efficiently with EBVs. It's the seed stock producer's decision on which direction they want to go. EBVs are the tool to get you there. And then finally, I hear people say, well, all this talk about genomics in Australia and the beef cattle industry, we should be focusing on that. And in reality, if you're a Katahdin producer, you've probably already heard this, but genomic enhanced EBVs will be available for NSIP Katahdin breeders in the very near future, and hopefully for other breeds later. Including genomic information into our EBV calculation is expected to further improve our accuracy, and particularly for lowly heritable traits and animals lacking extensive pedigree connection. But at the end of the day, we'll still just get a number that will indicate the genetic merit of an individual, and no technology will completely replace the need to collect and record data on individuals. So now we've discussed the benefits of EBVs, let's talk about how we can actually use them in practice. Like I said, an EBV is just a number that indicates the genetic merit of an individual for a trait relative to, in our case, the rest of Katahdin sheep enrolled in NSIP. So we've got 2 rams here, and we've got their EBVs for weaning weight, fecal egg count, and number of lambs weaned. And we can compare them by calculating the difference between their EBVs for each trait. So for weaning weight, 3.22 kilograms on the left, minus 1.8 kilograms on the right, we'd say Ram 1 is expected to carry a set of genes that make him 1.4 kilograms heavier at weaning than Ram 2. For fecal egg count and number of lambs weaned, we take the difference between these 2 rams' EBVs, and we say, we also expect Ram 1 to carry a set of genes that give him 87% lower fecal egg count and 10% greater lamb crop at weaning than Ram 2. But in many cases, or in most cases, these rams have already performed for weaning weight and for fecal egg count, and they'll never perform for number of lambs weaned or a U trait. So EBVs are really best used prospectively and in regard to their progeny's performance. So we'll pretend we take these 2 rams and randomly mate them to a group of ewes and look at the progeny from them. Since they transmit half of their genes to their progeny, they also transmit half of their EBVs. And we again take the difference in EBVs between these 2 rams and divide it by 2 now, because they got 50% of their genes from their sire and the other from their dam. So doing this, we'd say we expect lambs from Ram 1 to be 0.7 kilograms heavier at weaning and to have a 43% lower fecal egg count than lambs from Ram 2. And if we keep replacement ewe lambs out of these 2 rams, we expect ewe lambs from Ram 1 to have a 5% greater lamb crop at weaning than ewe lambs from Ram 2. So comparing expected progeny performance between 2 rams also lets us assign a relative value to them, which is particularly useful when you're sitting at a ram sale. How much are you willing to spend on one ram compared to another? So here's a simple example that we could use to address that question. We expect, again, all lambs from Ram 1 to weigh on average 0.7 kilograms heavier at weaning than lambs from Ram 2. And we assume we breed each ram to say 30 ewes. Each ewe weans 1.6 lambs, and we use these 2 rams for 3 seasons. Okay. Over the course of their breeding life, we expect to market over 100 kilograms or 225 pounds of lamb more from Ram 1 than Ram 2, which in the case of $1.80 a pound for market lambs and nowhere higher than that now, would equate to over $400 for this ram's breeding life, Ram 1 over Ram 2. So we can afford to spend $400 more on Ram 1 than Ram 2, and anything less is a bargain. And this number is conservatively low because we aren't accounting for other traits like reduced dewormings or greater lamb crop, and we aren't accounting for grand progeny out of these rams that might carry an expected 25% of these rams' genes, and so on. Usually we want to improve the performance for multiple traits at a time. We want to increase number of lambs we wean, increase individual lamb weight. We want to improve internal parasite tolerance, maybe improve our carcass characteristics and ensure that our ewe weights aren't getting too heavy. So selecting for multiple traits simultaneously is made much easier by multiple trait indexes that were developed within NSIP and elsewhere. And these indexes are comprised of individual trait EBVs that we then weight according to their relative economic importance or biological importance. So one index we use for terminal sire producers in NSIP is the Carcass Plus Index, which attempts to identify individuals superior for lean carcass growth. So it puts positive weightings on weaning weight and post-weaning weight, body weight, so we can increase growth. It puts a positive weighting on loin muscle depth, so we can increase muscling, and it puts a negative weight on back fat depth, so we can maintain leaner carcasses. Okay. A much more important index for Katahdin specifically is the hair index, which is a bit of a misnomer because it does not give you the shedding ability of animals. It was developed to identify the weight of lamb weaned per ewe, or animals' genetic merit to improve total weight of lamb weaned. And it does this by placing large positive weight on number of lambs weaned and smaller positive weights on individual lamb weaning weight and maternal weaning weight, which is an indicator of milking ability or overall maternal ability. And it actually puts a small negative weight on number of lambs born, which might seem contradictory, but here we want ewes to wean all of the lambs that they give birth to. We don't want to just increase number of lambs born, we need them to wean more lambs. So a ewe that gives birth to triplets but only brings home twins is probably not going to have an index value as high as a ewe that only gave birth to twins but brought both of them home. So for me, indexes like the maternal hair index make breeding and selection decisions much simpler. So when we're breeding our ewes at US Mark, I first set a threshold value, and this threshold value might change from year to year, but I use the hair index and set a threshold and say any mature ewe we have that's below this threshold, which is generally about 30% of our mature ewes, she gets bred to a terminal ram. These ewes are still productive mothers. They're still able to rear lambs. They're just not going to raise replacement ewe and ram lambs for us. So now this gives us a proportion of our lamb crop that is benefiting from heterosis because we've crossed them terminally, and benefiting from the greater average growth and carcass characteristics of the terminal breed that we use. And these aren't just any terminal rams we can find. We can improve the impact of our terminal crossbreeding system by identifying individual terminal rams with the aid of NSIP EBVs as well, but focusing on terminal traits, right? We wouldn't go out and find the highest number of lambs born Suffolk ram lamb out there because he's not generating replacement for us. Focus on those terminal traits. And then, so we've set this threshold. When it comes to selecting replacement ewe lambs or ram lambs, we might have a different threshold. And any individual that's below the threshold for hair index gets marketed. We're not keeping them as replacements. No matter how much you like their mom, no matter what, we don't keep them as replacements. Now that we've set this threshold, we can go back to those that were above that general threshold for overall productivity and start to nitpick them, right? Or improve individual traits of interest, whether it's we want to focus more on milk production or more on internal parasite tolerance. So to wrap things up, estimated breeding values calculated by the National Sheep Improvement Program are the most effective, accurate method of selecting genetically superior replacement animals that's available to us in the United States. Using NSIP EBVs, again, should be the standard operating procedure for all levels of profit-driven sectors in the US sheep industry. We're not just numbers chasers in NSIP, we're profit chasers. So if you're a commercial producer, you should expect the person you buy rams from to give you EBVs to ensure this ram's gonna perform for you. As purebred seed stock producers, we always need to be focused on the needs of the commercial producer. And good quality purebreds make good quality crossbreds. EBVs are an important tool, but they're not our only tool. We can't breed our way out of poor management, so stay on top of your nutrition and vaccination and overall husbandry programs if you really want to realize the full genetic potential of your improved animals. NSIP EBVs aren't going to identify your poor structured, half-bagged ewes. You still need to make those husbandry improvements yourself. NSIP EBVs aren't going to identify that your ram fails a breeding soundness exam. You still need to get him tested. So use EBVs as another tool in your toolbox to improve your operation. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Any from our local audience? Or our online audience?
So, Dr. Murphy, quick question. So one thing that I hear from producers a lot that are looking at NSIP is especially commercial producers, they'll ask how they're supposed to select specific EBVs. So they look at my sheep, and let's say they want to improve growth. They'll ask me, what growth should I target for? So, obviously point them towards the higher growth rate animals. But I've had some producers that have wondered how do they know if that's going to take backwards from their averages. So maybe you could just address that for some people, just as far as how to maybe select if they don't have NSIP data on their current rams, how to kind of get an idea of moving forward.
So I couldn't hear most of that question.
Oh, I'll come to those.
Or if there's anyone else that would repeat that. Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So just, I guess, a quick question. So sometimes I'll have commercial producers that are interested in NSIP, but don't have any data on their rams or their ewe flock. They're just, commercial producers. And they're wondering what level of traits to select for, since they don't know kind of where they're currently at. What's your recommendation for those people, since they don't have kind of a baseline average for their flock to know how they're making improvement and how to actually step forward versus if they're kind of staying consistent? Should they just try a ram and see how it compares? Should they, I guess, what are some recommendations for those who don't have kind of that baseline idea of where their animals currently rank?
Yeah, that's a good question. For us, genetically, the best guess we can say is that those individuals from that flock are right at the breed average for every trait. That's our best guess. So if you're selling rams to that producer, as long as you get a ram above that 50th percentile for the traits that that producer is interested in improving, that would be a good start. Of course, you could market them at your highest genetic potential animals, but our best guess is they're right in the middle. And if we give them rams or ewes above the middle, they should be improving.
Awesome, thank you.
Other questions for Dr. Murphy?
If you cross out on a different breed, because the Katahdin Association allows you to do a few generations in and then bring in that other genetic blood, how does that affect the heritability of the different traits? Are there certain breeds that are more heritable, say for weaning weight, things like that? Does that affect that at all?
No, in general, heritabilities, they're a biological estimate, so they don't really change all that much across breeds or even species. I did a lot of dairy sheep work in my PhD, and most of the heritabilities we got for milk production traits are in line with what you see in dairy cattle. So there are some small differences maybe in heritabilities across breeds, but it's usually just due to the structure of the data set. But so in terms of what crossbreeding a proportion of your flock will do, if you're an NSIP producer, I'd recommend placing those crossbred lambs in a different contemporary group. So they're compared with each other. I think we have some recommendations on what data to exclude from them. You'd still want to have a record that they were born so that you gets credited with those lambs. But making sure that it's handled, because we can't explicitly tell NSIP that they were crossbred. But no, in terms of changing heritabilities of traits, that's not a concern with crossbreeding.
Thank you.
So Tom, we had one from Tess. Thoughts about breeding crossbred or hybrid ewes to purebred sires?
I think it's a very good idea. So your crossbred ewes. So when we just breed a Suffolk to a Katahdin ram, it's not a great example because Katahdins are composites, but assuming they're a purebred animal, we're just getting individual heterosis, right? The lamb is a crossbred, but his dam is a purebred. We can get maternal heterosis and improve that ewe's fertility and prolificacy above the average breeds that go into that cross and milk production by having a crossbred ewe. So yeah, you can extend this example by getting Katahdin rams and breeding them to Dorper ewes and generating a crossbred ewe and getting maternal heterosis, and then top crossing to a terminal ram and getting big gains in market lamb traits while maintaining productive ewes with heterosis advantages.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have from online. How about in our audience here?
Tom, you mentioned in your presentation that genetic tools will not supersede good management. We have that on record, but do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Well, unfortunately, we work with a lot of nutritionists too, as us geneticists, and genetics is really the only thing that matters. But a lot of times that works against us because, you know, when you apply a new nutrition program, you automatically and immediately see, or fairly immediately see, the potential and improvement from that management program. And I think some people expect that to happen with selecting animals that are genetically superior. You know, you go to a ram sale, you get all hyped up that you just bought that really superior ram, you take him home, you still got to go breed ewes. You still got to get lambs out of them. You raise those lambs up to breeding age. You breed those ewes to get lambs out of them for multiple years. You're not going to see that genetic improvement for a pretty long time. It takes some time. So, and furthermore, more on your question there, with you can have really high EBV animals and not provide them adequate nutrition, not have a mineral nutrition program, and they're not going to perform to the level that you expect them to perform if you don't supply them a beneficial environment. You know, we talked about the genetic side of that equation. The environmental side is equally important. Ultimately, we want to improve performance. We can improve it by improving breeding value, but we can also improve it at the same time by improving our environment.
Thank you, Tom. I was being facetious and baiting you a little bit. You did a good
I
job.
could tell.
Any more questions? Well, Tom, we really appreciate it. As always, your talks are well delivered, but very informative. And as a nutritionist, I always am open to learning more and more about what I should know.
Well, thanks, everybody.